It is an honor and delight to be here with Peter Beinart, who is a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York, a contributor to The Atlantic and many other outlets. Thanks for taking time to talk.
Thanks for allowing me here.
So my experience has been that there is a relatively toxic culture in the American Jewish community and beyond around discussing matters related to Israel.
Right.
How do you assess what the current reality is in terms of how that discourse looks?
Yeah, I think it is toxic. It's toxic partly because people care a lot,
Right.
So they care enough to be willing to shout at one another.
Yeah.
But it's also toxic because there is a consensus. There was more of a consensus, and now there's less of a consensus. There's a certain fraying, and that has produced, and it's a very intimate divide. You see it within families, often along generational lines. And I think the fraying of that consensus is very frightening for some people. And people on both sides have really existential fears about the state of Israel. I think, historically, in the early 20th century, there was a huge divide among American Jews between Zionists and anti-Zionists. A lot of Orthodox Jews were anti-Zionists, a lot of Reform Jews were anti-Zionists, but after the creation of the State of Israel, and especially after 1967, I think there was a period where there was a sense of support for the State of Israel, basic support for the Israeli government, pretty much is something that most Jews would agree upon. And even if you didn't like the policies of the Israeli government, let's say during the Lebanon War or the First Intifada, you were never questioning Zionism itself. I think that has started to fray now because of the sense that that the two-state solution may be gone, that some people in the American Jewish community just can't live with the idea of one state which controls millions of people who lack basic rights. A sense among some younger Jews that they don't feel the sense of connection to Zionism their parents did because they don't see the need for a Jewish state of refuge, because they've never seen in their lifetime kind of state-sponsored anti-Semitic persecution leading to a mass exodus of Jews like from the Soviet Union or something.
Yeah, right.
So they're more willing to question the entire enterprise when they see things that Israel doesn't like. And Netanyahu has been a very polarizing figure because being so associated with the American right.
Very interesting. So the trauma and glory of the 20th century narrative of the Holocaust and the birth of Israel as messianic fervor has shattered for younger American Jews. And one of the points I hear you pointing to in terms of a shift is the disillusionment with a two-state solution. What else would you point to in terms of a shift in terms of what the discourse looks like today?
Part of it, I think, is that one of the reasons the consensus is frayed is that the American Jewish community is frayed. Right. It's less of a community, which is to say the center has collapsed, right? The center among American Jews was, let's say, Reform and conservative people who belonged to synagogues tended to be tribal, but not very religiously observant, right? Secular tribalists, right? They're disappearing, right? Their children are generally secular universalists, right? And often disaffiliated from any Jewish institution. And so highly universalistic, more universalistic in their perspective than their parents. Their parents are trying to balance a kind of liberalism in general, tended to be liberal on American domestic issues, with a strong sense of Zionism and commitment to the Jewish people. The children in general tend not to have as strong a commitment to the Jewish people, tend to be more purely universalistic. On the other side, as you know, the demographic growth is taking place in the Orthodox population, which is highly particularistic, right? Highly focused on the well-being and preservation of the Jewish people in particular, and very deeply connected to Israel. And so, you think about two young American Jews, one growing up in a highly secular, universalistic environment with very, very little sense of any special obligation to the Jewish people, and the other growing up in an almost totally self-enclosed Orthodox milieu. That's part of the reason that the conversation is so difficult, because there's very little common basis of experience between those two wings of the American Jewish community.
In what ways does the Israeli left look similar to the American Jewish left and what's happening now? And in what ways is that discourse fundamentally different in regards to peace and conflict in particular?
That's interesting. So I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that there are two very different kinds of Israeli left. There is the Arab Israeli left, right? So one of the things about the American Jewish discourse about Israel is that very frequently the term Israeli is used as synonym for Israeli Jew, right? 20% of the population inside the Green Line are Palestinian citizens of Israel. So, and in some ways, they're the most powerful left that Israel has, right, in terms of numbers, right? They're an anti-Zionist left, right? Doesn't mean that they don't want to live in a Jewish state by and large. Right. It doesn't mean that doesn't mean they're taking arms against the state. Right. They may be willing to vote. Doesn't mean in a certain sense they're not even good citizens, but they feel like second-class citizens in a Jewish country, in a state which privileges Jews when they're not Jews. Right. So that left is represented certainly by Palestinian activists here, and by a small wing of the American Jewish community, Jewish Voices for Peace, for instance, largely anti-Zionist in orientation, and would say, look, we don't believe in the idea of states for particular ethno-religious groups. We believe in states that provide equality for everyone, at least in theory. Yeah. The Jewish left in Israel, by and large, which is very weak, as you know, associated with a party like Meretz, for instance, is trying to support a two-state solution, partly so they can preserve a Jewish state that's almost also democratic, and trying to think about how to make Israel, even inside the Green Line, more genuinely democratic, right? And that has resonance here with a group like J Street, for instance. And there's a significant group of American Jews there. Probably a higher percentage of American Jews are there than are of Israeli Jews, for a variety of reasons, right? Partly you have a larger ultra and modern Orthodox population in Israel, which leads to the right. You have a larger Russian population, which leads to the right. You have a much larger Mizrahi population, which tends to lead to the right? American Jews if you looked at just secular Ashkenazi Jews in Israel, they would look more like American Jews, because American Jews are mostly secular Ashkenazi Jews. Yeah. But in Israel, most people are not secular Ashkenazi Jews, and that's part of the reason that ideologically the two places are tilted so differently.
And yet it makes sense that their primary concern is self-interest. I remember 5 years ago there was excitement about young activists in the tent movement. Yes. And what was it ultimately about? What were the ultimate activists? I can't pay rent.
Yes,
which is,
exactly.
You can't critique someone for wanting to pay their rent, but that was the fervor. Yes. It wasn't ideological about some grander vision of a just state in some sense.
Right. Although there may have been some of those people who were trying to reconnect to an earlier socialist Zionism, which has been lost as Israel's become more... Right. But that's also been one of the fundamental realities, of Israeli politics, that the Palestinian question has not been as central to Israeli politics as it had been a decade or so ago, mostly because relatively, not entirely by any means, but relatively compared to the Second Intifada, things have been quiet. Yeah. And the Palestinians, sadly, tend to get on Israel's radar screen when they create violence, and that forces Israel. When there's not a lot of violence, Israelis will talk about the fact that you can't get an apartment for a reasonable price in Tel Aviv.
Right. So, what do you see as the role for young progressive American Jews in regards to Israel today, who feel disillusioned and feel marginalized from Jewish establishments? Right. And feel both their religious experience or maybe even their status, the religious status issue, is discounted, and feel that concerned by growing trends of fascism across the seas, and yet don't want to be called self-hating Jews and be kicked out of their families. What do you see as their role in this?
Yeah, I mean, I think their role is really crucial. Yeah. I mean, I think it is younger progressive American Jews in groups like If Not Now and J Street U who are changing the debate inside the Jewish community, and I think that's generally a healthy and important thing. They are, as young people, sometimes challenging the conscience of an American Jewish community that I think has become numbed to a status quo in Israel, that if you go and see it up close in the West Bank, let alone if you were to go to Gaza, no matter, even if you come from the place of deepest Zionism and connection, one of the things I think is so wonderful about a group like Encounter and these other groups is that they just take people to see things, and so that awakens people's conscience, and so that call to conscience I think is really crucially important. I think the challenge is to do it in a way that also affirms a sense of solidarity with the Jewish people, and with the Jews of Israel, and not to get into a place where you are only projecting hostility and anger, but that there's a kind of a loving criticism, even if the criticism is deep and passionate, and that you show that you have a deep connect, you care deeply about Palestinians, you also care about the welfare and future of the Jewish people. And I think it's a little bit easier. It's never really easy. But in my own experience as someone who gets called a self-hating Jew, a fair amount, but tries and wants to talk to people who disagree with me fundamentally, I feel like if I can convince them that the welfare of the Jewish people is of paramount importance to me, then that creates a connection between us that maybe makes the conversation a little bit easier.
Great. So what does a healthy sense of nationalism look like? With the nationalistic fervors that are so dangerous and sweeping the globe, it seems that one who doesn't want to embrace that is really kind of left out. And so who is generating a healthy sense of, I still identify as a Zionist in the broadest sense of connected to this enterprise, and yet I need to clearly distinguish that and differentiate that from what's happening.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's difficult. I mean, I think that on the broader question of nationalism, I think that love of your country and devotion to your country is entirely legitimate. And it is legitimate to care more about people, your fellow Americans, than people in other parts of the world. And because we are a people, a global people that also happens to have a nation, I think it's legitimate to have a special concern for Jews. In that way, I think we haven't figured out a way of talking about this, but this gets caricatured as dual loyalty. But the truth is, it's entirely understandable and legitimate that Jews would feel a special connection to Jews around the world. Why were Jews protesting for the Jews of the Soviet Union and not protesting against all the other human rights? And for that matter, why shouldn't African Americans be able to say we have a special obligation to the people of Haiti, given our common experience and ancestry with them, right? But on the other hand, nationalism can't become idolatry, right? You shouldn't worship it, which I think is what.
Well, that's what's happening today.
Yes.
I mean, I think when you look at where the heat is at, where do people get excited?
Yes.
It used to be people debated God, they debated ideas, they debated halacha, denominations. Today, I mean, a rabbinic colleague said to me, worse than him standing on his bima saying he doesn't believe in God, is to go to AIPAC and not stand and clap every time his congregation does. That is like the number one. So it's like, what's the idolatry? Is nationalism becomes an eagles a half, a golden calf.
I think that's one, and I think this is some of the work you do is so important because we have this tragic combination of extreme, often intolerant Zionism, right? Like where to ask fundamental questions about Israel's behavior or about Zionism itself is essentially the equivalent of reading Yud He Vav He in synagogue, like makes everyone, and combined with often a deep indifference to the actual most fundamental questions that the idea that Judaism could teach you how to live a good life, right? So we're failing in some ways on both of those counts, I think. And you're right, the one in some ways is replacing the other in a lot of places.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
It feels like something has to be cultivated. That on the one hand, there's Jewish supremacy and ethnocentric, ideologies. And the other hand, there's a sense that actually I don't feel any more connected to a Jew than someone else. And actually, there can be something cultivated, as you said, where there's a preference, just as you prefer to take care of your sick mother than a sick stranger.
Absolutely.
You prefer to take care of your family and be in conversation with your family, and that doesn't necessarily mean you're ethnocentric or you're a supremacist. But we don't see that cultivated so much. I think there's a silent middle, as you said.
It's there's a tension there, and also to say that Zionism is not only a success, it's not only an allegiance, it also seems to be a test, right? And I think David Hartman talked about this, and people, that power is a test, right? The Jewish people are being tested by power in a way they hadn't been in a very, very long time, right? The last time they were tested by power, you can argue the Hashmonean dynasty didn't go very well, right? And so it seems to me that's another way. I mean, that's, I think, something else we can say is that if you can, this dissent, this criticism can be an act of allegiance, an act of love, because you want the Jewish people to meet the test of power. You want the Jewish tradition to meet the test of power, and you recognize that if it doesn't, the consequences are maybe very serious. And I think that's another kind of thing that people can say. For me, a group. It's a controversial group, but a group like Breaking the Silence for me is a group that embodies that. Right? These are Israelis young Israelis who served. First of all, they served, in the military. They didn't shirk their military duty, but they saw things that genuinely disturbed them. Not because Israeli 18-year-olds are bad kids at all. It's because their government put them, just like America's government put people in Vietnam or in Iraq, in morally untenable situations that corroded their own souls because they were put in the place of being occupiers. And they're exposing that and talking about that. And yet they're doing it as loyal Israelis, many of them, as you know, also religiously observant, you know. And to me, that's really inspiring, you know. And so for me, like, one of the reasons that I want to do what I do is to feel like if they're doing what they're doing under more difficult circumstances, then people in the relative, you know, ease of the United States should try to be in solidarity with them.
So do you feel that the current administration in Israel has crossed enough lines that to give Prime Minister Netanyahu or the like a platform is to be morally complicit, or to attend conferences that give them a platform is to be morally complicit?
It's a difficult question, right? Because partly you could say, how can American Jewish institutions not give a platform to the Prime Minister of Israel, right? I guess what I would say is, if you're going to give that platform, there has to be some space to criticize or challenge, or at least present an alternative point of view. Like, I mean, for me, you know, the problem with the AIPAC conference, and, you know, there are lots of wonderful, wonderful people who go to AIPAC. And I mean, the problem for me is that partly it's just about, there's just something fundamentally wrong about having a massive conference with hundreds of speakers about Israel and basically having no Palestinians. To me, the notion of talking about people without giving those people any chance to talk for themselves is a recipe for dehumanization, even if you don't want to dehumanize people. Even if that's not your intent, it's the effect.
Okay, excellent. So my last question for you is, what do we do now? And I don't mean in terms of peace and conflict. That's a big question. But in the discourse. How can we shift the tide on such a toxic discourse? What should be some of the rules or norms of engagement to try to maintain a healthy Klal Yisrael, Jewish people, and also make sure that Jews aren't abusing our power and privilege in the public American political discourse in some ways?
Those are such important questions. I mean, I think the differences are, I think the left and the right have different challenges. I mean, I think for the right, the challenge is to be willing to go outside of the bubble and hear, especially Palestinians, to be willing to expose yourself. Not only because it's so important to humanize people, but also because, and this is what I've said this to high school students coming out of these Jewish day schools, you are intellectually unprepared for what you're going to experience at college, because those Palestinian kids are much more familiar with the Zionist narrative than you are with, and your schools have failed you by never giving you a book by a Palestinian to read, So that's, I think, the challenge for on the right. It's to be willing to have the courage to listen to people who are scary, you know? And then I think the challenge on the left, I think, is to solidify and deepen the commitment to the Jewish people, which I think has to do with study, and it has to do with engagement with tradition. I don't think it's good enough if you say to be a Jew is to believe in social justice, but then someone says, okay, but what are your sources in Jewish history, in Jewish texts, and you only can say vaguely, well, you know, we were good in the civil rights movement.
Tikkun olam.
It's not enough. There's not enough depth there, and you won't be taken as seriously by people on the right who are more deeply rooted in those texts and those traditions. And so I think that's the challenge for the left. And you know, and you do, not to toot your horn, but like, you're one of the people, I think, more than almost anyone in the country, who actually provides people with that foundation that they need.
So check out Peter Beinart's amazing writings, books, and articles. Just in the last week, a number, Who's Silencing Who at AIPAC, and other important pieces. Thanks so much for this.